to eliminate backlogs and meet our country's economic needs while addressing future workforce challenges. Most importantly, this will ensure Americans can reunite with their family members in a fair and timely fashion. This is related to what we were just reading, in that some of these people are here but lacking lawful status, even though they are technically qualified for it, but they would be affected by this Florida bill. And it's just an example of how that bill is just intentionally discriminatory, because it's just, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go there again. I just did that. But yeah, you know what I mean. So that was a related argument. Let's see what else we have here. So we're... Okay, I thought this was interesting, and this is related to stuff that's going on in Europe right now. So I just thought I would read about it here. This is entitled, Black Immigrants Face Unique Challenges. Over the past 20 years, the black immigrant population in the United States has more than tripled, from 600,000 immigrants to 2 million immigrants. That population is diverse, with a majority migrating from African and Caribbean countries. They comprise around 10% of the overall black population in the United States. Even with the growth of black immigrant population in the United States, they continue to face unique immigration challenges rooted in anti-black discrimination. Black immigrants face higher rates of detention and deportation than other immigrant populations. An AFSC study from 2021 found that black immigrants in Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention were more likely to have lengthier detentions and were 6 times more likely to be sent to solitary confinement. While black immigrants consisted of less than 6% of the undocumented immigrant population in the United States between 2003 and 2015, they represent over 10% of immigrants in removal proceedings at that time. Further, according to Black Alliance for Just Immigration, 1 out of every 5 non-citizens in deportation proceedings based on criminal grounds before the Executive Office for Immigration Review, or the EOIR, is black. Black immigrants are also denied asylum at a higher rate than other people. While the overall number of deportations from the United States of immigrants decreased in 2017, the number of deportations of black African immigrants increased. Discrimination against black immigrants has persisted under the Biden administration, which continues to implement the Trump administration's Title 42 policy. The Biden administration also continues to deport black immigrants at high rates. In fact, ICE is anticipated to deport approximately 2,000 black immigrants just in the month of February. The administration has been especially unfair to Haitian migrants. It has allowed a mass expulsion and deportation of these Haitians, and those still in the United States face discrimination. Currently, more than 40% of the families in ICE detention are Haitian migrants, and the average bond paid for Haitian migrants averaged $16,700, 54% higher than the rate for other immigrants in detention. So the rest of that article talks a little bit about the author and his experience in this work, and I didn't think that was necessarily germane. I read the first part, though, because I think that it is important to recognize this situation when we're talking about immigrants. A lot of the focus tends to be on people coming from south of the border, and the assumption is that they're all Hispanic in some way, if I can use that term. Latinos, Latinas, that sort of person. But there are really a lot of immigrants in the United States who are facing challenges, and some of them are unique to the countries that they come from. And in this instance, for example, that it is unique to their perceived ethnicity. And it is important to be aware of these things and to keep track, because if we don't, then these kinds of inequities just go on and nothing's ever done about them. Okay, let me move on here. This is a sort of random aside, but this is entitled, U.S. Immigration Agency Replaces Trump-Era Mission Statement That Removed Nation of Immigrants Label. The federal agency that oversees the legal immigration system on Wednesday replaced a controversial Trump-era mission statement that had removed the Nation of Immigrants label, calling the U.S. a nation of welcome and possibility in its new creed. In an internal message to agency employees, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, Director Jadoo said the new mission statement better reflects the Biden administration's commitment to an immigration system that is accessible and humane. We strive to provide a timely decision, be it a yes or no, and with the utmost respect to every petitioner or person who seeks a benefit from USCIS, be it a U.S. citizen seeking to reunite with a family member, a U.S. business attempting to hire a skilled foreign national, a lawful permanent resident seeking naturalization, or a person who hopes to find a place of refuge from persecution, Jadoo wrote. Wednesday's change, while symbolic, is part of a broader Biden administration effort to erase remnants of the immigration agenda employed by the Trump administration, which focused on restricting most avenues of legal immigration and used harsher rhetoric towards immigrants. Last year, the Biden administration directed immigration agencies to discontinue terms like illegal aliens that it deems dehumanizing. In 2018, an outcry among progressive immigration advocates and others ensued when the Trump administration issued a USCIS mission statement that, among other changes, omitted the Nation of Immigrants passage present in the agency's previous and long-standing mission statements. The Trump administration statement read, quote, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services administers the nation's lawful immigration system, safeguarding its integrity and promise by efficiently and fairly adjudicating requests for immigration benefits while protecting Americans, securing the homeland, and honoring our values. Then USCIS Director Francis Cisna said he removed customers from the mission statement in 2018 because he believed the word fostered an institutional culture that focused on satisfying people applying for immigration benefits. Quote, use of the term leads to the erroneous belief that applicants and petitioners, rather than the American people, are whom we ultimately serve, Cisna said at the time. The Biden administration replaced the Trump-era mission statement with a shorter, though significantly different one. Quote, USCIS upholds America's promise as a nation of welcome and possibility with fairness, integrity, and respect for all we serve, end quote. In her agency-wide email, Jadoo said the new statement incorporated feedback from 750 employees who responded to a survey. Overwhelmingly, the word you submitted was integrity, and you also cited compassion, service, security, respect, decision, fairness, innovation, welcoming, and opportunity, she told employees. Michael Knowles, a U.S. asylum officer and president of Local 1924, a union representing USCIS employees in the greater Washington, D.C. area, praised the new mission statement, saying it renews our sense of purpose and affirms what our country stands for. The way we treat those seeking our protection determines who we are. The American dream is either renewed or betrayed, one case at a time, Knowles added. When we treat each individual with dignity and respect, we keep faith with the promise. Employees at USCIS adjudicate applications for green cards, asylum, refugee status, U.S. citizenship, work permits, deportation deferrals, and other immigration benefits. Since President Biden took office, USCIS has instituted numerous policy changes, many of them to reverse limits on legal immigration imposed by the Trump administration. The agency halted a 2019 rule that made it more difficult for low-income immigrants to obtain permanent residency and reversed some asylum restrictions. But USCIS, which is mainly funded by application fees, continues to struggle with a mounting backlog of petitions that has crippled its ability to review cases in a timely manner, and the agency still largely relies on paper records. It also has yet to implement several key Biden administration policy proposals, including a plan to revamp the asylum process at the U.S.-Mexico border and a rule to shield the Obama-era Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program from legal challenges. Okay, our next article is entitled How U.S. Visa Delays Are Taking a Costly Toll on Frustrated Workers. Delayed work permits mean some immigrants risk losing their jobs, even as the U.S. experiences labor shortages. More than 1 million immigrants are waiting for U.S. work permits, cutting many of them out of the job market when labor is in short supply. Processing times for visas and work permits soared after embassies and immigration offices closed for months due to the pandemic, creating a backlog of cases that the immigration agency is still struggling to work through. Processing times for visas and work permits soared after embassies and immigration offices closed for months due to the pandemic, creating a backlog of cases that the immigration agency is still struggling to work through, and highlighting what critics say is the cumulative effect of years of dysfunction. President Joe Biden ran on improving the immigration system and unwinding restrictive policies implemented during the Trump administration, but processing times have continued to balloon even as some embassies and offices have reopened. The estimated wait time for a work permit has risen to 8 to 12 months, up from about 3 months in 2020, according to data from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's affecting workers like Waqar Akil, who graduated in December with a doctorate in computer science from Duke University and signed a job offer to start at Google in the new year. An immigration delay of more than 4 months caused him to nearly lose out on that opportunity. Although his work permit was approved in October, Akil, 29, had to push back his start date multiple times after USCIS failed to send him the card, which he needed in hand to start work. It was only after Akil hired a lawyer and threatened to sue that the government finally produced his work permit, less than 3 weeks before a deadline to start work or potentially have to return to his native Pakistan. As an expert in internet privacy and security, Akil is the kind of hire that U.S. tech companies are competing to attract. Google has been willing to wait for his work authorization to come through, but the fear that he would lose the opportunity was never far from his mind, Akil said in an interview. He was at risk of losing the offer because they're not going to wait forever, he said. The number of pending work permits has soared during the pandemic, with nearly 1.5 million applications at the close of the fiscal year ended September 30th, compared to about 649,000 at the end of the previous fiscal year. By contrast, there were 10.9 million U.S. job vacancies at the end of December. As they wait for their permits, skilled immigrants like Akil are forced to dip into savings to cover immigration costs and life expenses. Furthermore, a lack of transparency about the process. Akil says he has no idea why USCIS would send him his work authorization card right away, means that Furthermore, a lack of transparency about the process. Akil says he has no idea why USCIS wouldn't send him his work authorization card right away, means that immigrants have very little recourse other than suing in federal court, an expensive and time-consuming process. Right now, I devote my entire career to suing USCIS and the State Department to challenge these ridiculous, unreasonable, and unfair processing times. Josh Goldstein, an immigration lawyer in Los Angeles, said in an interview, "It's absolutely out of control." Google is encouraged that the Biden administration has made improvements in processing certain work permits, but there is still work to be done, company spokesman Jose Castañeda said in an emailed statement. These delays can cause uncertainty for employers, employees and their families, he said. We continue to call on Congress to pass comprehensive immigration legislation that improves employment-based visa programs that enhance American competitiveness and gives greater assurance to immigrant workers and employers. Jadoo, Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, acknowledged last month that processing times have become too long and have affected the livelihood of immigrants. USCIS has implemented new policy and operational improvements to reduce both the numbers of pending cases and overall processing times, a spokesman for the agency said in an emailed statement. The government has implemented several measures to limit work permit processing delays, including lengthening the visa validity time and offering automatic extensions for certain categories of visas, he added. Nikita Scott Naylor, a 34-year-old HR manager living in Tennessee, was let go from her job in September after the agency failed to send her work permit in a timely manner. The UK native applied for a green card in April, and under the agency's guidance at the time, she should have had new work authorization granted before her previous work permit expired. Scott Naylor relied heavily on $25,000 worth of savings that she and her boyfriend had accumulated to cover living expenses and their mortgage, which normally costs her a little over $1,500 a month for her share. She was eligible to continue on her prior employer's health care plan, but at about $700 a month out of pocket. Scott Naylor decided after 3 months she just couldn't afford the extra cost. In the middle of the global pandemic, the last thing you want to do is find yourself without health care, she said. After appealing to her congressperson for help and lodging multiple unsuccessful requests for the agency to expedite her work permit, Scott Naylor was approved for a green card last month. She never did receive the interim work authorization she had been waiting for, which would have allowed her to travel outside the country while waiting for permanent residency. It was incredibly stressful, she said. You're thrown into the unknown, right? You can't go out and work. You can't leave the country and go visit people. You're not sure if you're going to have to do this for a month, 6 months, a year. The U.S. government typically does not consider imminent loss of a job to be a valid reason to expedite a work permit, according to Alyssa Taub, an immigration lawyer at Siskin Susser in Memphis, Tennessee. Delays are also impacting immigrants outside of the country. Mahmoud Hassan was a bioenergy researcher at a lab in Tennessee who had returned to his native Bangladesh in October to renew his passport. In order to re-enter the U.S., he had to get a new work permit stamped in his passport, and his application has been mired in administrative processing for months. Hassan was let go from his job after the lab couldn't wait any longer for his authorization to come through, and because his work permit was tied to his employer, he now has no way to get back into the U.S. After paying $900 in monthly rent for 3 months on his Tennessee apartment where he lived with his wife and 10-month-old child, Hassan eventually gave up the apartment because he couldn't afford to keep paying without a job. He's got $13,000 left on his car loan and no way to sell it or place to store the vehicle. I cannot get a visitor visa to sort out these problems because the embassy is closed, Hassan said. The only way I can go back is if I get a job, and then I can deal with all of these things. Hassan and his wife are staying with family while he applies for jobs in the U.S., hoping that he'll find an employer that will sponsor a new visa. Although the financial burden has been significant, he said the disruption has also been hard on his academic career and halted research that he spent more than 2 years on, and that was paid for by the U.S. government. I'm really frustrated by the loss of my data, said Hassan, who has a doctorate in genetics from the University of Melbourne in Australia. A researcher's career depends on how many publications you can produce. Work permit processing times have gotten so bad that many lawyers no longer bother trying to tell their clients how long they can reasonably expect to wait, Taub said. Policy changes made under the Biden administration, such as granting automatic extensions to health care workers with a pending work permit renewal, have made a marginal difference but fail to address the systemic issues, she said. There's a lot of positive rhetoric, but not a lot of substance. The pressure on foreign workers and immigrants extends beyond just the financial. Tara Singh, an Indian software engineer who lives in Austin, Texas, had to miss his mother's funeral in 2021 because he wasn't allowed to leave the country. He applied for a green card in October 2020 and is still waiting to receive interim authorization from the government that will allow him to leave the U.S. without abandoning his application. He has filed multiple requests with the government to expedite approval for his travel permit with no success, Singh said in an interview last month. That is the biggest impact that I have felt being here for the past 18 years, Singh said. When I can't travel to meet my own family, I think there is something seriously wrong with the systems and policies in place. Mark Walter, who moved from Germany in late 2020, wasn't able to work for more than a year while he waited for work authorization through marriage to his wife, who is a U.S. citizen. He gave up a successful career in sales so that he could live in the U.S. while his wife attends law school, and they exhausted savings and maxed out a line of credit trying to supplement her student loans while he couldn't work. It's been a constant struggle, he said. I went from being able to afford anything I want from working in savings to thinking about anything we spend money on. His work authorization came through last month, and Walter says he'll take the highest paying job he can to dig himself out of their financial hole. With the green card now in hand, Scott Naylor was hopeful she'll be able to return to her old job, which will allow her to rebuild her savings account and buy a plane ticket home this summer to see family after nearly 3 years away. I hadn't realized just how much of a weight was on my shoulders until I got the approval, she said. My mood was like a 180. It was incredible. So, yeah, the system is messed up in more ways than one. And honestly, even comprehensive immigration reform isn't going to fix some of these problems. A lot of it is bureaucratic, and it's going to be messed up until each individual agency and each individual agency's processes are repaired. So there are multiple problems, and it's all only exacerbated by anti-immigrant rhetoric that just kind of muddies everything up and mucks everything up and makes a big problem for everybody, because those things leak down into these and make fixes for these kinds of problems difficult to come up with. So it's long and it's complicated and it's very messed up. Let's try something else here. Here's some more questionable news. So at the beginning of the show, we heard about Florida and their screwed up system. Now we're going to hear about Texas. So this is entitled, A Key Pillar of Biden's Immigration Policy is Going on Trial This Week in Texas. One morning last July, Roman Perez pulled his truck out of his driveway in Bunkersville, Nevada, and found officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement waiting for him. If Perez had been arrested during the Trump administration, more than likely he would still be in detention or deported to Mexico. But during the Biden administration, Perez is not considered a priority for enforcement. Under enforcement guidance issued by the Homeland Security Secretary last year, living in the U.S. illegally is no longer by itself enough to arrest or deport someone. That's a big difference, says Sylvia Esparra, Perez's lawyer. Practically speaking, it has helped a lot of people, she said in an interview. The Biden administration points to those guidelines as a success, a tangible change that has improved the lives of immigrants all over the country, even as much of the administration's immigration agenda has been derailed by politics or blocked by federal judges. Now these enforcement priorities are in jeopardy too, as a legal challenge against them heads to trial this week. Quote, here we go. These are laws passed by the United States Congress that the president is not enforcing, said Texas Governor Greg Abbott last month during remarks at a border security briefing. His state has been leading the legal effort against the Biden administration's border and immigration policies, often steering the cases to federal judges appointed by former President Trump. Conservatives in Texas and elsewhere complain that the number of ICE arrests and deportations have fallen sharply, and that local jails say they've been forced to release undocumented immigrants who previously would have been picked up and detained by ICE. But Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas defends the new enforcement priorities. We will not dedicate our limited enforcement resources to apprehend individuals who have been here in this country for many years, who have been contributing members to our communities, he said in a speech last month to the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Seems reasonable, right? Mayorkas says ICE is now targeting threats to public safety and national security, and exercising what's known as prosecutorial discretion by deciding which cases are worth pursuing and which are not. Under the new guidance, immigration authorities are supposed to consider the totality of the circumstances in each case, including whether an immigrant is caring for a family member or has a potential pathway to legal status. Many of these mitigating or humanitarian factors are actually part of the history of prosecutorial discretion and who's been protected, said Shobha Shiparsvalvadia, a law professor at Penn State University who studies prosecutorial discretion, in an interview. There's no doubt that prosecutorial discretion made a big difference for Roman Perez and his family. Perez has an old drug conviction on his record, and an immigration judge had previously ordered his removal from the U.S. After he was arrested, Perez was detained for over a month. They took everything out of my life in like 1 second, he said in an interview. Nobody knew where I was. While he was detained last summer, Perez worried about losing his thriving business as a handyman and about how he would support his wife and their 3 children, who are U.S. citizens. He told his 10-year-old son that he was working on a job far away and didn't know when he would be home. I got to lie to him, and he'd get mad at me, Perez said in an interview. He says, "You should come home. I don't want you to be working out of town. We don't need our money," he said. And he's 10 years old. Some immigrants and their advocates complain that ICE is still pursuing cases against people who should not be enforcement priorities, while the administration's critics on the right say it's taking the idea of discretion way too far. Prosecutorial discretion is supposed to be the exception, not the rule, said Laura Reese, a former top Homeland Security official under the Trump administration who is now with the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in Washington. This administration is using it as an excuse and as the rule to not enforce the law, Reese said in an interview. The legal challenge from Texas and Louisiana is set to go to trial this week in Houston. It will be heard by federal judge Drew Tipton, who was appointed to the bench by former President Donald Trump. Tipton has already tried to block the DHS guidance once before. Well, that's all I have time for. I wanted to get into some Ukrainian immigration news because that's a very big story right now, and its reactions to it are very different from what we're getting from other immigration cases. But we'll see how that plays out in the future. Maybe that will be the substance of my next show. In any event, I thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.